Welcome to the Wednesday lesson here at the Order of Eden. Today we're continuing our trek through church history, and we're going to be finishing up our section on the Protestant Reformation. So we talked about the typical reformers like Luther and Zwingli, and then last week we talked about the Church of England. But today we're going to be talking about a movement called the Radical Reformation. Okay, so what is the Radical Reformation? Well, they're kind of defined in contrast to some of the other reformers. So technically the Reformation under Luther or Zwingli, that's known as the Magisterial Reformation, and that deals with the way that they blend church and state. So take John Calvin, for instance. He ran the nation of Geneva basically as a theocracy. He was the leader of the nation, and the laws of the nation were based around tenets of Protestant theology. The radical reformers rejected this idea, though. They didn't like the Catholic Church, but they also didn't feel that Christianity should be forced on people in this other way as well. They adopted the model of the church from the book of Acts, where basically the universal church meets locally as their own groups, and they aren't governed by some overseeing body since the apostles are no longer with us. Basically, they held many things in common with other Protestants, but rejected the idea of a single church organization. So obviously, since they weren't under a single authority, these groups would find themselves differing on a whole bunch of issues. They all believed that the Bible was their only guide to spiritual truth, but that can be interpreted or understood in many different ways. Many groups from the Radical Reformation fell under the umbrella called Anabaptists, but not all of them. Anabaptists were given their name, which really means rebaptizer, because they believed that baptism was for someone who consciously, willingly chose to follow Christ, and that baptism wasn't meant for infants who had no choice in the matter. Since many Christian groups baptized infants, the Anabaptists considered that baptism worthless. So later in life, if someone got saved or decided to follow Jesus, they would baptize them then, even if they had been baptized as infants. Many groups in the Radical Reformation were pacifists, but not all. Many parts of the Radical Reformation rebaptized, but not all. But they universally agreed that church and state should not mix. Part of not forcing Christianity on anyone. This led many to see Constantine and the Council of Nicaea as a great form of apostasy because they saw it as a certain type of merging of church and state. The various groups had many things in common, but they tended to not have large, well-known leaders like other branches of the Protestant Reformation because they weren't building these large state-sponsored organizations. But they also had much to disagree on. Many people split off to form all sorts of groups. Some delved into mysticism. Some very strict groups ended up as the Amish or the Mennonites, which are still around today. Some became what we know today as Baptists, and really the whole non-denominational or evangelical movement owes a great debt to the Radical Reformation. So the Radical Reformation was far less organized than the rest of the Reformation, but they still have just as long-lasting effects. Last week we looked at the Church of England, that's Protestant in doctrine, but still holds to all sorts of traditional modes of worship, and they're literally the church of an entire nation. And today we see the extreme opposite end of that. The Radical Reformation believed many Protestant teachings and taking them even further, and they rejected large-scale church structures. They took on many traits of the early church, and sometimes they were on point, and sometimes it got a little weird. But that's all I'll say about the Protestant Reformation. We talked about the main players like Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. We talked about the high liturgy of the Church of England, and the primitive Christianity of the Radical Reformation. Many shades to a single event that changed the West forever. So from everyone involved with the Order of Eden, thanks for watching. I hope it was a blessing, and I'll see you in the next one.